we're going to move on. We are, unfortunately, in a very tight time frame, so we're moving on to the next talk, or session, which I am chairing, Learning to Talk Policy. And mindful of Professor Chapman's lessons by anecdote, I thought I would relate one. About a month's time, I'm going to be going to Papua New Guinea and explaining the results of a fairly multifaceted scientific study of a lake to a group of community villagers who probably have about, on average, 2 or 3 years of educational experience all up, and who don't speak the language that I'm talking to you in now. The reason that's of interest as an anecdote is that the last time I had a meeting with those particular communities, they threw rocks at the car that I was in, and the only way we managed to escape was by bringing out the riot squad. That sort of thing highlights how important it is to learn the techniques of talking science across the cultural divide. There's nothing like that to help focus the attention, I can assure you. So that's what this session is about, learning to talk policy. How do scientists communicate well to policymakers so they understand what we're on about and understand the value of the message that we're trying to convey? We've got 3 very eminent panel members to talk to us. We have Professor Emily Banks, and I'll make sure that I get this right, who is currently the Head of Chronic Disease and Epidemiology at the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health. We have Professor Hugh White, who is the Professor of Strategic Studies at the ANU and has a distinguished career as a Senior Advisor and Public Servant. And we have Martin Hoffman, who is the Deputy Secretary for the Department of Industry and Science. So 3 people who are very versed in this particular issue. So I will ask Professor Emily Banks to come and present, and if we can work out the technology to get... You've had instructions? Wonderful.
So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and paying my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to thank the Parliamentary Secretary for a really inspirational talk, but also by being who she is in the role she is. I have 2 daughters, and my youngest, at the age of 6, had sort of dismantled a torch and came to me with a set of pliers and something else and said, "Mummy, it's my dream to be an engineer, but I just don't have the skills." So I think it's role models like the Parliamentary Secretary who can really help in that situation. I'd also like to thank the organisers for bringing all these terrific people together, and to also say hello to the illustrious company we're in. Now, I'm going to talk about getting evidence into policy and practice and the role of large-scale data. But before I start, I think it's quite important to actually really reflect on what we're defining as science here. And I've heard the previous conversation to me seem to illustrate quite a particular and implicit view of science that probably needs to be discussed. I think a lot of people think of science as sort of late night, all alone with a test tube type of things, but in fact there's a lot of science that is about prediction. There's a lot of science that's about monitoring. There's a lot of science that is about implementation. And so science doesn't just have the potential to provide that inspiration, that spark, that breakthrough. It has the potential, and often does, have a really important role to play in the implementation across that whole continuum. I chair the Advisory Committee on Safety of Medicines for the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and I'm also a member of the Drug Utilisation Subcommittee of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee. So I have both a role as a researcher, but also roles as a scientific advisor in the implementation of what we know about drug safety, about drug efficacy, but also about drug subsidy. And I would argue that one of the reasons why you might use drugs as an exemplar of how science can influence policy is that there are actually systems in place that make scientific input an integral part of the decision making. And so when Bruce is, when we're in the situation where the Minister says, well, how much is this going to cost? We are no longer in the Bruce Chapman situation of saying, well, I have no idea. We actually have scientific evidence about the likely uptake, the likely costs, the factors that are likely to influence it, and we can actually create systems. So one of the things I would also say is that researchers can influence policy through their findings. Researchers can influence policy as advocates, But one of the biggest ways that we can influence policy is by being part of and contributing to systems that bring science into policy as a matter of routine. So Australia has had a massive triumph over cardiovascular disease. Not many people know about it. We've basically, won the Ashes or the Rugby World Cup for the last 46 years, but nobody knows about it. So we've had an 80% drop in cardiovascular disease mortality since its peak in 1968. And the reason we've had that is a very widespread series of highly granular activities. So it's been individual people giving up smoking, it's been communities encouraging people to give up smoking, it's been changes in diet, it's been people taking their blood pressure medications, it's been granular conversations about taking statins, it's been better management of cardiovascular disease. But because of that, we now have around 45 to 50,000 deaths from cardiovascular disease a year. We would have 200,000 deaths a year if we had continued at the level in 1968. Now, nobody's aware of that. You don't find people going in the pub, we overtook Japan in the late 1990s, but, and that was because of the increased taxation, and they seem to be catching up, and then we brought out the plain packaging. Nobody talks about that. And we're very, very vulnerable as a community to misinformation because we don't know about that. If we'd won the Ashes 46 years running and someone said, let's change the coach, the team, the fielding scrap, we probably would say, well, hang on a second. So there is actually also a need for public education. Now, my model, one of the models, I think, for really integrating science into policy is really about big data and the importance of big data, but the importance of big data as business as usual. So has anyone, now this is going to seem like an obscure model, but has anyone here heard of the OkCupid website?
The data on there is amazing.
Isn't it? Okay, so the OkCupid website, this is just an example, and I'm not saying it's an example of a model, not of what you should go out and do. So OkCupid is one of the United States' largest online dating sites, and it was developed, I think, by geeks, presumably because they couldn't get dates. It's got huge amounts of data on there, and what they've done is they've taken those data, applied really, really hardcore statistical techniques to almost any element of it to provide information for stakeholders to improve what they do. So I'll just give you an example. Men, if you want to find a match in life, your profile picture should be out of doors, looking away from the camera with an animal. Okay? Women, you're better off being indoors, looking directly at the camera, but doing something interesting that someone can actually then ask you a question about. Like you're great at dominoes or whatever. Now, and cleavage shots will get you more hits, but fewer conversations. So I think that, imagine if we applied that model to our health statistics. Imagine if we applied it to our statistics about how well we were doing with different elements of water quality and things like that. So I'm just going to now, I'm conscious of time and I've whittled on a bit. So anyway, I think that one of the key important things about data is it gives you information and evidence to base your policy on, and it takes away quite a lot of that adversarial or advocacy-based conversation. Now, Goethe, well, let's go back 200 years. Goethe says, thinking is easy, acting is difficult, and putting one's thoughts into action is the most difficult thing in the world. And this is of value to scientists because implementing what you have discovered is incredibly hard. But for policymakers, it also recognises that the policy process and implementing what you actually want to put into action is actually incredibly difficult. If you actually look at the term research translation, the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of translation is just to express an idea in another sort of simpler form. For example, I'll translate that into words even the thickest of you can understand. Now, it could be interpreted when people talk about research translation that the process is basically to take something in science and make it so those stupid policymakers out there can understand it. And I think that this is a big mistake. And in fact, if you look at the Wikipedia definition of translational research, it just says it's research that helps to make findings from basic science useful for practical applications. Now, I think this is highly problematic because it is essentially a supply-driven model. It's scientists saying, oh, I've got some findings, how can I make them out there, get out there better? Because a lot of translational research is not about getting basic science into practice. It's actually about how to do what we do better. It's models of patterns of care or models of how to implement different interventions. So this supply-driven model, I think, is part of why scientists have difficulty talking policy, because they think that if only they could just take what they've got and translate it into things that the policymakers would understand, that would sort it out. So that's a pet hate of mine. Oh, I was going to ask, who here has heard of the Kingdom model of the policy process? Okay. So one of the things I would encourage scientists to do is actually to get a better handle on the policy process. And I would say this, the Kingdom model of policy, is probably, to my mind, the truest to life. So essentially what it says is you've got a thing called a problem stream, and there's some sort of community or media work which triggers interest in a problem. The issue is recognise a significant problem. At the same time, there is a political stream, which is all about the political imperatives and the imperatives within the policy space. And the third is the policy stream, which is looking at a range of alternative solutions, and it's actually at this point that scientific advice comes in. Findings can also trigger things in the problem stream, but what often happens is you then have actually quite a narrow policy window. It can be a matter of hours, as Bruce said, it can be a matter of weeks, and it's often too late when you get to this window to be really putting hardcore, rigorous scientific findings in there. So, and then you get policy action. So in a sense, the important thing is to remember that as a scientist, you probably want to partly be here. You want to be actually developing relationships with policymakers. You want to be showing that you can provide evidence that is useful in an ongoing way, because it's about relationships. And obviously the previous panel talked a lot about interfacing with the political stream, but we also have a role in raising with the community issues about the problem stream. But I think that unless you have any sort of understanding of how complex the policy world is, you will be doomed to feel that you're banging your head against a brick wall as a scientist trying to get more influence or trying to get your findings translated. Now, the other thing I think that, moving on to the talk about big data, this to me is one of my favourite quotes about science, and it's by Bertolt Brecht, unexpectedly. He says that the aim of science is not to open the door to infinite wisdom, but to set a limit to infinite error. And this is, in some ways, the Popperian model of science, but really saying that data, and I would put data in there, data tells us much better what we're doing wrong. It's one of the best things about it. You can try something, you can look and see what the results are, you can tell what you're doing wrong. It provides guidance about what to do right. And I think that was the point that one of the speakers made earlier, that science can say, here are some ideas, but it also has a role in telling you when you've implemented something, whether you've done something that's effective or not. So in a way, this is also the counterpoint to the Goethe thing about how difficult it is to implement things, that data and our systems can really, really help us these days. I also often turn to Looney. There's a big world out there. People are running around catching diseases and doing all sorts of things. And we can use science to give us a kind of understandoscope. So in terms of data and data systems, I don't need to tell you, it's about joined up collections of data. It creates frameworks. We can do it in a micro and macro way. And there are multiple examples in health that I've listed there where we actually have the potential to bring together a lot of systems about health. We already have a lot of data, but they're not being brought together optimally. We use a lot of these in the work that we do on drug regulation, on health things, but we don't bring them together optimally. And these are, I think, they have enormous potential for improving policy translation. They're particularly enhanced by additional data collection and particularly on person-centred outcomes. So we often have data systems that are geared around health services activity or activity within a sector that we have to pay for. We don't have information about what matters to the community. So things like quality of life, disability, mental health. So I think that there's a big role for bringing those in so that the drivers of the system are actually things that people really want. So I would actually also argue that when people are trying to translate their findings, they have to recognise that this space is extremely crowded and the whole area of health is full of things that have already been translated from before. So you're actually putting something into a system where people have an investment in what's already happening. So you often find you can actually measure the guidelines that GPs have to use in terms of feet, rather in terms of putting the guidelines one on top of the other. So translation has already happened. But it is important to note, as I mentioned, that the improvements are granular and they are gradual and they have been highly successful, at least in this country. The data systems allow us to do a lot of different things in this area. We can work on the development of solutions, and we can understand their magnitude and importance, and we can then look at implementing those and how well we've done. Big data, there's a very big problem with workforce, and I think we've already alluded to the lack of interest in sort of mathematics and quantitative sciences. It's nowhere more acute than in big data, because handling these data take an enormous amount of skill. It's not so much a question of computer capacity, we have that. It's about actually people who can handle these data. So this is my quote. I think in policy, as in many other areas, the answer to many important questions that people consider to be intuitive are in fact quantitative. So we've got some work coming out about smoking and mortality. Everybody knows that smoking's bad for you. Everybody knows that smokers are more likely to die prematurely than non-smokers. But how much and how much more likely they are matters, and how much earlier they're likely to die matters for policy. And so it's often about getting the quantitative information into there. So we've gone from 1 in 6 smokers being killed by their habit in the 1960s to it being like tossing a coin in the 1980s and 90s, so 1 in 2. We're now, our latest figures from Australia that are going to come out in a couple of weeks, is that 2/3 of current smokers will be killed by their habit. So, and that takes us, there are 2.7 million smokers in Australia, 1.8 million smokers will die of their habit if they don't quit. So I think that this applies across the board. And especially, you can see it in the drug area, you can see it in the subsidy area. The questions are not, is this value for money? It's what is the cost effectiveness ratio for this drug? So I think we need better systems, and I think the PBS and the TGA provide really good examples of integrating science into decision making. One of the issues that we do face from policy, from the point of view of researchers, is that defining the appropriate questions and how data can answer these is not something that comes naturally to policymakers. I quite often have workshops with policymakers. They do say that they're interested in the data, they'd like to understand more about this, but actually framing the questions in terms of things that can be answered by data is not something that is highly developed within the policy area. And I have to say that in lots of areas, there has been a swinging of the pendulum away from content expertise. It's not happened so much in the TGA because people recognise you need an understanding of drugs, but actually often people are speaking about policy development in terms of process and not in terms of content expertise, and it makes it even more difficult to frame these questions. So I think a key role for research is actually to work in partnership with policymakers to help to frame the questions in the first place. So this is the ultimate key performance indicator for Australia. This is a sentinel age group for premature mortality, aged 35 to 69. It's better than life expectancy because that incorporates infant mortality and death at later ages, and it takes a while to catch up. So there's only one country doing better than Australia in terms of overall mortality in the age group 35 to 69, and that's Iceland. Now, who knew that? Who knew who won the Asian Cup? Okay. So we've been doing incredibly well. With women, we're in terms of these 5 things, we're second to Japan. But I think that it's these kinds of performance indicators that policymakers need to understand and need to have at their fingertips and need to have as part of their system, of the systems. I was going to do an example. I don't know, can I see how I'm going for time? 3 minutes, okay. Well, I was going to do an example of effective policy translation, work on hormonal therapy for the menopause that I was involved in for since the mid-1990s. I'll just go over the slides quickly, but one of the issues we were facing in the mid-1990s was about 1/3 of women aged 50 to 64 were taking hormone replacement therapy, and nobody really knew what its risks and benefits were. We had a huge proportion of the population on it. So this is just a graph from the UK showing we were up to about 30% in the mid-1990s. Single biggest proprietary medication in the US was Premarin, a brand of HRT, in the mid-1990s. So it's massive use. There's evidence to suggest that, I won't go through this, there's evidence to suggest that cancers, the rate of increase in the risk of cancer slow after the menopause. So there's evidence to suggest that if you give women these hormones, it may increase those. We also had evidence from collaborative analyses that the risk of breast cancer was increased among current and recent users of HRT, but there were a lot of uncertainties. And what we found was that women were asking questions, and the UK National Health Breast Screening Program was one place where they asked questions. So the UK Breast Screening Program came to Professor Valerie Beryl and colleagues at the University of Oxford to say, can we have some sort of huge research project to look at this? So policy collaboration was integrated from the beginning, and the question was a policy and community relevant question. From 1996 to 2001, 1.3 million women joined the Million Women Study, and they were recruited through the breast screening program. Of those women, 9,000 developed new breast cancers, and we found these results. So basically, this is the line of no effect. Women who took estrogen-only HRT had a 30% increase in risk. Women who took combined estrogen-progestogen HRT, which was the most common type, had a doubling in the risk of breast cancer over that time. We were also able to show that it increased with increasing duration of use. And these were added then to findings from the Women's Health Initiative, and at that point of release of findings of the Million Women Study, there was liaison with the Committee on Safety of Medicines, who issued a statement to all health professionals in the UK, and the Australian Drug Evaluation Committee did likewise in Australia. There was extensive media. It was also then the process of granular translation took place, and I won't bore you with the numbers, but basically we acquired information over time that let us go through every single one of the sort of risks and potential risks and benefits for HRT in terms of serious life-threatening disease, and to multiply all of those different risks out to come up with figures that government and policymakers could use. So what we found was if you weighed up the excess risks of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, endometrial cancer, venous thrombosis and cardiovascular disease, and minus the beneficial effects on hip fracture and colorectal cancer, you actually came out with a net adverse profile, which was a number needed to harm of 71. So for every 71 women taking HRT, there was one of these potentially life-threatening adverse events. Now it's really important, and that was for women in their 50s, for women in their 60s, it was a number needed to harm of 45. Now it's very important to remember that women are taking these medicines for relief of menopausal symptoms. This was challenging the widely spread idea that women should be taking them permanently from the menopause onwards for prevention of disease. So the message for policy and practice, which was distilled down into guidance for practitioners, was that hormone therapy should only be used for menopausal symptoms and not for the prevention of disease. It should be used for as short a time as possible with regular review. If you can avoid combined estrogen-progestogen therapy, that has greater harms than estrogen only. And we need to provide updated information when that comes in. Now, the beauty of this is that we can actually look at the health outcomes now. So this is the use of HRT in Australia here. This is the point when those results were released. So we actually had a halving in the use of HRT once that more judicious targeted use was put out. This is breast cancer incidence in Australia. And we actually had an unprecedented reduction in breast cancer incidence coinciding with that. There was no other clear explanation for that drop in breast cancer incidence. It has now been observed in other places. So that actually translates into around 800 fewer breast cancers each year in Australia through more judicious use of HRT. Similar patterns in other countries. So the lessons for policy about large-scale data is to start with an important question and make sure that what you're doing is demand-driven to some extent. Now, I would also have to say that I think within the science portfolio, we need a balance. So you do need blue sky, curiosity-driven research. We need everything across the continuum. But if we're really going to interface effectively with policy, we need to be answering questions that are important to policy and the community. We need to create and maintain relationships with policymakers. It has enormous potential, but we're at its early stages. And we need to actually have it as business as usual, and we particularly need to understand what success looks like. So I had a meeting when we had some initial findings about smoking and mortality with Minister Nash and her then Chief of Staff, Alistair Furnival, and they were concerned that the reductions in smoking in Aboriginal people were not moving fast enough, and that we needed to do something about the programs. And I was able to provide data to say, actually, the reductions in smoking in absolute terms in Aboriginal people have been greater than in non-Aboriginal people. It's still too high. But the other thing is we've had a 40% drop in mortality from cardiovascular disease in Aboriginal people from 1997 to 2010. And that's a massive drop. So we can say that's what success looks like because we have the data. So I will now turn to Lumig again, and just to say that we really have to bear in mind that success in the policies, in the actual real world, is really quite messy. And it's a very granular process. It's a community process. It's messy, and we're doing some things right and we're doing some things wrong. But large-scale data have a massive ability to contribute. Thank you.
Hey, that's got a bit. Look at that. Well, thanks, Ross. Thanks, everyone, for a chance. Katrina and her team, delighted to be here, and lovely and a bit intimidating to follow Emily. All I'm really going to do is to elaborate on a couple of the points she made, and I fear elaborate on them a little bit less colourfully and charmingly. I start from a slightly different position, because I am, as Ross mentioned, I'm not really an academic, and I'm certainly not a scientist. I'm a policymaker turned academic, and my academic background, such as it is actually in philosophy, so I'm completely useless. But as a policymaker, I spent a lot of my career, most of my career, working in defence, and working often in what is, in its own way, a very technologically intensive area, that is working out what kind of military capabilities Australia ought to be buying. And so I'm very familiar with the situation of being a policymaker sitting there with all sorts of extremely brainy and highly numerate people looking at me and wondering why the hell I didn't understand what they were saying to them. It was pretty bloody obvious, wasn't it? Well, actually, often it wasn't to me, and that was the story of my life, trying to understand where they were going. So that's where I come from on this issue. And what I want to do is, from, so to speak, the other side of the divide, is to offer you a few thoughts about how to talk to policymakers in a way that might actually get them to hear what you're saying. And my starting point is that the key to doing this is to understand how policymakers think, and to understand that policymakers think differently from you. So the art, and this picks up a point that Emily made very nicely, the art of communicating with policymakers is not just to do what people, notoriously English speakers, do when they come across someone who doesn't speak English. That is, just speak louder. No, so it's no good just trying to simplify. Got the same message, the message you brought from your laboratories. Just saying it simpler, in shorter words, that doesn't work. It's a much more sophisticated communication challenge that you face. And in order to meet that communication challenge, you actually have to think yourself into where the policymaker starts from. And this is particularly true in those situations in which the policymakers don't start by coming to you. There are some areas of policy, actually Emily mentioned a couple, where the policymakers actually come to the scientists and say help. But very commonly, and in some very important policy areas, it's actually you who need to go to the policymakers and find a way to say and persuade them, you need our help. And it's particularly in those second cases where being really clear about where they're coming from, so you can not just talk their language, but think like them, think like a policymaker. That's what I'm going to try and sketch to. And my starting point is a very simple one. And that is that the key difference between policymakers and scientists is that policymakers are not after the truth. Now that sounds like a very cynical statement, but it's not. It's a quite specific observation. That is that the aim of science is to create new knowledge, to discover new truths or eliminate old falsehoods. I think it's a very nice distinction. The aim of policy is to make decisions. And the distinction between making decisions and seeking the truth is a very important one. Actually, it's the one that's picked up in the Goethe quote that Emily gave us, but my favourite source of it is dear old Aristotle. When Aristotle sat down and tried to understand how people thought, he himself recognised that there were two completely ways of doing it. There's the classical syllogisms, the classical modes of reasoning that you guys use all the time, inductive and deductive reasoning, where you work from data to a conclusion, which is the truth. And then Aristotle said there's a practical syllogism. And the conclusion of a practical syllogism isn't a statement of the truth, it's an action. It's doing something. An intellectual process whose conclusion is an action is a different kind of intellectual process from one whose conclusion is a truth. And when you are talking to policymakers, you're talking to people whose bottom line is an action. Actually, that's not true, is it? Their bottom line is a decision. Somebody else actually does the work. But deciding is what governments do. Government is a big decision-making machine. And when you're talking to policymakers, well, that's what the word policy is. I mean, it's a fancy word for a very simple thing. It's the choices that governments make. And your aim, as someone who's trying to talk to policymakers and influence policymakers, is to influence their decisions. And focusing on the decisions is absolutely at the heart of the enterprise. And the conclusion I want you to draw from that is very simple. That is, everything you say to a policymaker should focus on how your knowledge can support their decisions. And focus as tightly as possible on that. In other words, don't focus on what you know. Focus on the decision they need to make. Now, right at the heart of that is, or an element of that, is a choice that you need to make about what approach you take to thinking about the policy relevance of your work. Very commonly, among scientists, I'm sure, and I think about academics in general, is the thought that the way in which the natural way for an academic or a scientist to respond, to interrelate with policymakers, is to do the research on the thing you're interested in, then go to the policymaker and say, you should be interested in what I've done for the following reason. It's a pretty hit and miss approach, because actually the chance of them being interested in what you're doing is not that high. If you really want to maximise your policy input, policy impact, you have to turn that logic over and say, what's the problem they're wrestling with? What is the issue? What is the choice that Australian governments, some institution, needs to make? What best contribution can I make to that decision making? So the starting point in which you apply the thought that talking to policymakers is a matter of talking to people who are focused on decisions, is to make a judgment about how far you want the decisions they face, or, to be clear, the decisions they should face, not necessarily the ones they do think they need to make, the decisions that you think they need to make. How much should that drive your own approach to what sort of work you're doing? And if the idea of influencing government policy is important to you, then you better start thinking that way. And the more important it is to you, the more that should influence the choices you make about the kind of research you do. Now, in understanding what it means to talk to policymakers about their decision making, it is helpful, I think, to understand a little bit about what one might rather glamorously and deceptively call the logic of policy. Because there is a kind of a logic to policy making process, and it's more complicated actually than Aristotle thought. Maybe it was simpler in 5th century Athens, but it's more complicated now. And the key reason it's more complicated now is the way resources play into the picture. It is a kind of statement of the obvious that money matters a great deal to everybody, including to governments. But understanding quite how that fits in to the process of policy is quite important, because this is my steam-driven version of PowerPoint. The intuitive model most of us bring to the picture is that governments start off deciding they want to do something. And they work out then, there's an objective. And then that leads to a consideration of what actions we need to take to achieve that objective. And then that leads to a decision about how much it's going to cost. And that's the end of the story. If you want to achieve that objective, you've got to pay that money. It's a linear model. And a surprising number of people, a surprising amount of time, think that the way in which governments can or should make decisions is just to say, this is what we need, this is how we need to do it with, this is how much it's going to cost, shut up and pay the money. Governments never make decisions that way, and nor should they. And for that matter, neither do we. Nobody makes a decision that way. Because in fact, there's a loop. Governments decide they want to do something. They work out, with a bit of luck, what the most cost-effective way of doing it is. They work out how that much cost-effective way of doing it is going to cost. And then they say, ooh, are we really prepared to spend that sort of money to achieve that kind of objective? They might decide that we want to beat the Chinese at the gold medal tally at the Olympics. That's an objective. They might work out how you could do that. Multiply the size of the Australian Institute of Sports by 100, I guess. They might work out how much that would cost. About the same as the defence budget, probably. Don't get me started on that one. And then they'd say, oh, no, actually, we don't want to spend 1.9% of GDP on that, so we'll just try and beat New Zealand. And you go back round the circle, and what do you know? You can actually divide this is not meant to be rude about New Zealand. You divide the AIS by half, and the budget is much more manageable. And in fact, you keep going around that loop, looking at your objectives, finding out how much they're going to cost. Oh, that's a bit much. Oh, we wouldn't mind spending more than that, until they've come into balance. The quintessential policy process is a matter of finding the balance between the objectives you have and your willingness to spend money and sometimes other resources to achieve them. And what that tells you is the policy process you're trying to intervene in, engage in, is not a static one. It goes bang, bang, bang. It's a loop. And of course, like all loops, sometimes it's about that. Hang on, we can achieve the objective cheaper than you thought. Or it's about that. Actually, there's a whole lot of loops in this. So it's a very dynamic process. Some people think that building policy is like building a wall. That is, you start with building blocks. A lot of people think the building blocks are data. And you put one on top of the other in a nice stable way, no dynamic forces there, and then it's done. In fact, it's more like a tennis match. Everything's moving all the time, including, of course, the data is moving all the time, and the objectives are moving all the time, the costs are moving all the time. And so what you need to do is think yourself that you're getting into a very dynamic process. And of course that makes it sound complicated. In the end, it's very complicated in detail. It's not very complicated in principle. In fact, you can really say that any policy process is a matter of addressing a collection of 5 simple questions. The first is, what is the objective? Often framed as, what's the problem? What is it we're trying to do? Surprising how often policymakers go wrong by not answering that question clearly. The second question is, why does it matter? And in particular, how much does it matter? Unless you know why and how much something matters, you don't know how much it's worth spending on. And if you look at the way policy debates actually unfold, often the really uncertain piece of the question is not what the objective is in the first instance, but how much it matters and therefore how much it's worth spending on. And then, what are the options to achieve it? That's that bit. That's fairly straightforward. Often is very difficult in practice, but it's a fairly straightforward conception of how you look at those options. And then you have to ask which one's best, which one's most cost effective in particular. And then, can we afford it? Or do we go back and redefine our objectives again? So that cycle of what's our problem? Why does it matter? What are the options? Which is most cost effective? Which one's can we afford it? Those are the questions which policymakers, sometimes in quite an orderly and disciplined fashion, sometimes in a very muddled and undisciplined fashion, see under Australian Submarine Project 2015. Don't get me started on that. Those are the questions that policymakers are working through. And you want to ask yourself, if you want to play their game, if you want to be on their tennis court, knocking the ball backwards and forwards in that tennis court, you need to be asking yourself, helping them answer, and therefore asking yourself those questions. Now, two final points. One is a point about who is the audience, and this is at one level fairly obvious, but it is just worth bearing in mind. The phrase policymakers is a kind of an evasion, because it evades the fact that there is, in our system, no one person who makes the policy. It does emerge from a very complex, collaborative, interactive process, not always collaborative. And it's just worth making the point that the more levels of the process you engage with, the more chance you've got of influencing it. So the more different players in this three-dimensional or four-dimensional tennis match that you can engage with, the better chance you have of scoring. So it's politicians, it's staff, it's the public service, it's the vast range of stakeholders and interest groups and so on. And it is the media. And the point about the media, I just make this observation, one of the reasons why the media is, to my mind, a very important target in anyone who wants to get into the policy business, is that that's the way you get to all the others. I do quite a lot of journalism myself, and, well, for an academic, I do quite a lot of journalism, and people sometimes say, why do I do it? And I say, because I know the ministers read it. I could write them letters, I could send them YouTube clips or whatever, but the one thing I know they do is they read what's in the newspapers. There's one thing politicians really do. And as a way of communicating, and not just politicians, staffers, public servants, the other people in the field, it's a very cost-effective way of talking to the whole of the policy community at once. But of course, once you start thinking about the media, a bit scary, you start asking, what am I doing here? And that is a question for everyone who is not themselves a policymaker by profession, so to speak, who wants to or thinks about getting into this field. Because people are kind of nervous, and in some ways rightly nervous, particularly if they come from a scientific background or other academic backgrounds, for example, that value rigour and analysis and clarity and objectivity and all of that. Because there is a sense in which if you go past that, you become an advocate. And advocacy is a kind of a dirty word. Well, I want to encourage you to think that advocacy is not a dirty word. Polemic is a dirty word. Advocacy is not. Let me establish the distinction. There's analysis on the one hand, just do the stuff. There's advocacy, which is using that analysis as a basis for advocating a particular policy approach, shaping a decision. Polemic is when your advocacy is influenced not by your analysis, but by an ideology or a political predilection or something else. Advocacy is legitimate as long as it's driven by the analysis. But it's not just analysis by itself. It is a different kind of language. It's a different kind of game. It's my different sort of game of tennis. And I'd encourage you, if this is the kind of thing that interests you, not to shy away from advocacy defined in that fairly limited way. Thank you very much.
Ross, thanks. I'm certainly going to endeavour to avoid you having to take your feet again, I promise. Thanks very much for the chance to speak with you this afternoon. As Ross said, at the start of this year, I took over the role as Deputy Secretary for Science and Sectoral Policy in the Department of Industry and Science. What that means is certainly concerned with science policy, with working with the Office of the Chief Scientist, with commercialisation and innovation, with sectoral industry policy, that is policies and programs that affect the competitiveness and growth of particular sectors in the economy. It also includes some science organisations that are embedded within the department: Questacon, the National Measurement Institute, the Australian Astronomical Observatory, and the SKA project, So there's some quite direct, hands-on science administration in that sense. And the relationship with our portfolio agencies, CSIRO, AIMS, ANSTO, and ARENA as well, the Renewable Energy Agency. I have some background in that. After I finished my MBA, I didn't join McKinsey, but rather went to the Garvan Institute of Medical Research and spent 3 years working with Professor John Shine there, responsible for the administration of the Institute, commercialisation and engagement. I spent some time in the business sector, particularly digital media with Fairfax, Microsoft. My joke is I had a midlife crisis, and instead of the sports car, I became a public servant. I've been one for 6 years now, and in a very varied career, it's the best job I've ever had. I've spent the last 4 or 5 years responsible for resources and energy policy in the Commonwealth. As I've said, just in the last month, come to this role. So let me speak perhaps on, firstly, 4 things, 4 statements as a critical friend in policy making and the problems with the role of science impacting on policy making. The first is what I'd call the problem with the scientific consensus. And Brian spoke very powerfully about the role of the consensus, the role of the Academy statements, and I'm certainly looking forward very much to the statement next week on climate change. But the problem is Brian didn't win his Nobel Prize for maintaining the consensus about the nature of the universe. He won it by shattering the consensus. Another Australian Nobel Prize winner, Barry Marshall, won his Nobel Prize for shattering the consensus that ulcers come from stress and acid, and the action is you should be a middle-aged man drinking glasses of milk and avoiding curries, and showed that it was actually a bacteria. And of course, the famous story of him swallowing the bacteria himself to prove this. So, without making any statement about climate change, the statement that the science is settled, you should all know better than me, is a very scary statement. Because that's not how science works. That's not how the philosophy of science works. It's a punctuated disequilibrium where you get incremental improvements, incremental advances in knowledge, stepping out before the paradigm changes or is changed by someone who wins a Nobel Prize. The problem for policymakers then is, how good is this consensus? Is this one that we can rely upon for a period of time, and so we should be all encouraging men to drink milk because that's the consensus, or is it about to be changed? So that's the first concern. Now, that's not the statement that the danger of the consensus and that science is settled is a dangerous statement. It's not the same thing as saying we know nothing, and I'm not suggesting it is. I'm just saying policymakers are wary of overconfidence of the statements of consensus science. The second problem I observe at times is a belief, either conscious or unconscious, that the best form of government would be a philosopher king, would be the benevolent technocrat. And if only those politicians would listen to us scientists and do the scientific thing, it would all be a lot better. Now that may be true, but it's not how, as we've heard before from other speakers, the world works. If we look at Ian's example, he gave it as an answer to a question right before the morning tea. He said, we've surveyed scientists. It's not quite like Family Feud, but we've surveyed scientists, and only 15% of scientists think the best science is used in land use decisions. And he was putting this out as a bad thing, something that had to be addressed. The problem is, I'm pretty sure that if I surveyed economists, I think I'd only get 15% of economists who would say best practice economics is used in land use decisions. If I surveyed local activists, I reckon only 15% of them would say best practice community engagement techniques are used in land use decisions. And certainly if I surveyed property developers, even only 15% would say best practice pro-business, pro-economic development policies are used in land use decisions. It really depends whose perspective you're coming from, and the implicit assumption is that the scientific analysis of land use must be the best. And yet I don't think that is the way the world works, or necessarily the way we want the world to work. Our system is one of messy compromise. It is the worst system, I think, except for everyone else, as a number of famous people claim to have said, because in the end it's based on values. It's based on a contest of values. And what are values? They're basically, I believe, views as to the way of the nature of individuals and the nature of groups and the way individuals and groups interact or should interact in our society. And it's those things that determine land use decisions and other decisions. I think that's the way it definitely is, and I think I'd make the case it's the way it should be, and science has to see its role within that. The third problem policymakers have is, and it's a cynical one, I admit that, and that is that the answer to any policy question we might pose to science will automatically and inevitably be more research, please. When, as Hugh has said, the objective of the policymaker is to reach a decision, often in a constrained time frame. Now, I don't have a problem with that view of science, because if you don't ask, you don't get. I'm a big believer in that. But again, the idea that science is just one more study, just 6 months more, another season of data will somehow give us the answer, is not really the way it's going to work, whether that is even true in itself, and it's certainly not going to impact on the policymaker. Rather, I think as Brian very eloquently showed, we need a clear-headed and hard-headed understanding of the role and limits of science within the nature of the policy process. At the same time, I'd say avoiding a cynical and jaded view. The last point I'd make on the problems is we see the use and misuse of science by advocates, often ideological advocates, and the damage this does to science itself, and the need to try and avoid that. From my previous roles in energy, I've often struck by comparing the claims of the health effects of two different forms of energy production on rural populations involved. That is, the claims of people affected by CSG activity in the gas fields, as compared to the claims of people who claim their health is affected by wind turbine activity. And those two debates are treated very differently by advocates on both sides, by advocates more broadly in terms of environmental advocates or renewable energy advocates, etc. And yet the nature of the claims of the people involved are actually remarkably similar in terms of relatively broad spectrum of symptoms, chronic underlying concern. Maybe it is one of where more data will assist in this matter, but the use and misuse of science in that example, I think, is striking. So therefore, there were 4 problems. Finishing on a positive note, of course, 2 roles and applications that I've seen and value in science. Firstly, the role that science plays, and Emily spoke about this, in sort of the ongoing use of science within the policy process, where science is embedded in our processes, in our lives, in our regulation, in our policy processes. And this is done in 3 ways. Firstly, identifying the impacts of our policies, both pre and post their implementation, mitigating the impacts of those policy choices, the unintended consequences that Michael spoke about, And thirdly, loosening constraints that we often face in making policy. And there's a big role for science and technology in loosening constraints. The constraint, for example, around the average fuel efficiency or the average emissions efficiency of our vehicle fleet is a constraint to any climate change or emissions reduction target. The application of science and technology is one method of loosening that constraint. That's reasonably well understood, but we need to have science embedded, and we use science. Example again that we used in energy space was through, in the coal seam gas area, the introduction of the Independent Expert Scientific Committee, which was seeking, and the Office of Water Science in the Department of Environment, seeking to bring together scientists from a range of institutions to provide advice to the Minister in the application of the EPBC Act around aquifers, water, surface water, disposal of salt, and so on. Problems that very much depend upon the use of science. In offshore oil and gas, the use of seismic sonar surveys and drilling and their impacts on whale populations at various times of the year with migration and feeding patterns, etc., is very much about identifying potential impacts and then setting limits and boundaries to mitigate those impacts. An important and valid role for science. So that was the first one. The second one, though, of course, I think is the one that you're all probably more interested in, and that is the contribution, the long-term contribution of science to the debate and the development of the national direction, sort of larger scale type issues. And here I think, which is a huge topic in itself, but here I think we do have a good example of the way forward, and that is the work of ACOLA and the Learned Academies, again as Brian was referring to, around securing Australia's future, where we've seen impactful reports on STEM, country comparisons, the role of science and research and technology in lifting Australian productivity, completed in last year, I think 2014. And there's no doubt that those reports have impacted significantly on the policy thinking and policy direction of the government in industry policy. And you saw that reflected in Paulsec Andrews' speech, where she outlined some of the specific actions and funding that go from that. The other one of those that I know well, done by my good colleague Peter Cook, who I think I saw earlier, yes, engineering energy unconventional gas production, a very considered attempt to say the coal seam gas debate became extremely contested, is extremely contested. We're probably going to go down an industry development route for other forms of unconventional gas production, shale gas, tight oil, etc. What do we need to do to be ahead of the curve on that? And that was, again, a very impactful work. ATSI is carrying on that work through a major conference in September with the equivalent academies from the UK, China, and the USA all being here. I know that will be an important impact on policy making in that area for energy and resource ministers at the Commonwealth and state level. There are a number of other ones coming: Australia's comparative advantage, Asia literacy, new technologies, Australian agricultural futures, and sustainable urban mobility. So this goes, I think, to, again, the point that Brian made at the start, that science policy is a long-term game, and that's true. And these sorts of considered reports with the brand of ACOLA and the Learned Academies are impactful and are important. I'd add to the point about it being long-term in closing by just saying the other thing to remember about policy is that the window isn't always open. The policy window for change opens and shuts irregularly and unpredictably. The train leaves the station without a timetable. When it does, you've got to be ready. When you get the phone call about we're going to do something next month, what do you think? You can either have the I can prepare something in 1 month, or I've got something in the bottom drawer which has been worked on, has been considered, has been debated, hasn't got very far. No one's picked it up, but the window's open and now it's ready. And I think that's a key role for science in general. So I hope those comments, in a spirit of academic discourse, and open conversation have been helpful. I very much look forward to meeting those who I haven't met in the room and continuing the discussion. Thank you.
Wow, some pretty interesting output in those talks. We have time for some questions. So again, please, microphones.
Hi, my name's Kim Jacobson and I'm from the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute in Melbourne. I have a question for Emily. So you started off talking about OkCupid and more about, I guess you would call that data from psychology almost. So my question is, can we implement more psychology data to policy implementation? For example, with vaccines and communicating to the public, where I think a lot of people know the risks and have been told the numbers of risks of severe side effects from vaccination versus actually getting the disease, but there's more, I guess, complicating psychological factors that go into, making a subpopulation of people wary of vaccinations. So that's my question. Is there a role to get more psychological data to improve policy implementation?
It's a terrific question. I think that it really speaks to the whole granular nature of improving the health of populations. And what you usually find is that for any improvement, it requires a number of different approaches. So say if you want to look at tobacco control, where Australia is absolutely world leading, it includes taxation. It includes things like plain packaging, it includes laws about where you can and cannot smoke, but it also includes information about why people are continuing to smoke, what helps to support them to quit. And all of those things tend to add up to a range of things that influence behaviour. And it seems clear that the more difficult you make it to smoke, that will affect people's decision making. So I do think particularly there is a role for better communication about risk. And I think one of the problems is if you're missing out on things about numeracy and about literacy, you actually have a difficulty in health literacy, for example, in the population. So people become quite bad at judging risks. So they might think, that the risk of vaccination is much higher than the risk of getting measles, for example, or whooping cough, and that you can see how that plays out in reality. So there's a lot of work about how to communicate risk. It's hit and miss how it is actually how it actually plays out in real life, and you particularly see it also with chronic disease. So. We see it with the preventive medicines like antihypertensives and lipid-lowering therapies. Sometimes you have use of those in people who are you have underuse in people who are at high risk, who should be using it, and extra use in people who are at low risk. So there's a lot of room for improvement. I have to say that the statistics mean that what we're doing right seems to be outweighing what we're doing wrong, which I think is the sort of messy way, it's what success looks like. But if we can target those things better, then we will keep on having those incremental improvements.
Thank you. We had one there and then...
Rob Robinson from the Australian Institute of Physics and ANSTO. I'd like to talk to the other two, but my question about other things, but my question is also for Emily. Given that we're sort of at or close to the point where, individual genome sequencing is affordable, and you'll have, orders of magnitude more data to mine through, what do you think the implications are going to be, A, for personalised medicine, and B, broader impacts like what the effect is going to be on the insurance industry and so on?
I think that one of the key things that policymakers are concerned with is risk management in general. So they want to make decisions, but if they've made a decision, they then want to make sure they've mitigated all of the risks relating to that decision. Now, personalised medicine has huge promise, but it also has the potential to be a blind alley. And I mean, I'm not saying it is a blind alley, I'm just saying any sort of big change in the way we view things has both potential benefits and risks. and whole genome sequencing. I mean, we've actually found that the risks of disease conveyed by variation in someone's general genome, they're generally not large for common diseases, I mean, because of natural selection. So, but the personalised medicine area has a lot of opportunities in it, and it also has a lot of potential costs, particularly for medicines. So I think that one of the things that we need to do is have policy making that can use the data to be responsive and quick on its feet. So it can make investments in things that are promising, but measure whether that's really working and then actually change. And I think this really speaks to the idea that this idea of a scientific consensus that's kind of static, and that it actually needs to respond when new evidence comes to light. So I don't know if that's answered that question. I think it's often a situation where you have enormous promise, but you have to mitigate the risks that might be related to that.
Peter Cook, University of Melbourne. I've been involved in the nuclear debate in various ways, and my question, I guess, is for Hugh White and Martin Hoffman. It's very difficult to see how you can actually have a rational debate on nuclear industry, nuclear waste, whichever aspect you want to talk about, really. At the present time, particularly with 3-year timescales for governments and so on. I was talking to Brian Schmidt about this at morning tea, and Brian's suggestion was entirely reasonable. Well, we need an independent body that's away from politics to really deal with this issue. And certainly in the UK, I saw a body called NIREX, which was set up pretty much to look after nuclear waste, independent of government. But as soon as they started making potential decisions, governments got right involved in it. So what is the role of science in a debate like nuclear waste? I mean, is it something that you just wait on the sidelines until somebody, whether it's Bob Hawke or somebody else, intervenes in the debate from the political side of things? Or what? What is the role of science in that area?
It's a very good question, and I'm going to give you a rather depressing answer, I fear. And that is that in the end, policies made by government, and the politics goes through the process through and through, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way the thing works. Martin said it's a lousy system except for all the other systems that anyone's ever tried. But the capacity of a country, the capacity of a society, the capacity of a government to respond effectively to challenges does depend in the end on the quality of the leadership available. And that varies. And, I don't want to make too partisan a point of it. Well, it's not partisan because I'm going to say it about both governments. We have had poor quality political leadership in this country, poorer than the long run average, for the last, well, you can pick your own number. but let me make this point. It's not a question as to whether you agree or disagree with everything that a particular government does. It's a question of whether it looks to you like they actually know what they're doing. And to me, at least, the governments of Bob Hawke and Paul Keating and John Howard were competent governments. You could look at them and say, yes, these guys know how to run a country this size. And even though you disagree with particular things, it looked like a competent government. But we cannot take competence in government for granted. It's, sometimes things go wrong. And I do think there's a real question in Australia at the moment, and not actually just in Australia. There's an interesting question about government elsewhere, but I do think there's a question about that. And I don't think there's anything science can do about that, except, and this gets me to the point I made at the end of my comments before, that is, one's got to get out there into the debate oneself. In the end, our inability to reach a sensible conclusion, for example, about the place of nuclear power in Australia's energy mix, or the place of, or how we approach the question of nuclear waste, is the fact that neither side of politics is prepared to take that on as a serious policy question. When you get a consensus between the key political parties on an issue, it's very difficult to move it. At least you can't leave it to them to move it. And so you have to force change on the political process from outside. That does sometimes happen, but it only happens by people who get out there and advocate for it. So my slightly depressing answer is that for science to have an impact on areas where our present political processes are not delivering good policy debates or good policy decisions, they have to get into the political process themselves as advocates, and that's a hard thing to do.
So I'll give I think that's on. I'll give a more optimistic view, Peter. I certainly won't comment on the quality or otherwise of political leadership currently or in the past. I will make a passionate defence, though, for the system of elected government, in that, again, the belief that we can set up an independent, non-elected body that will, again, go to I think, the philosopher King myth, and somehow this body will make objectively true and correct decisions and we'll all be happy with them, is just not the way the world works or the way we actually want the world and our nation to work. I do believe that these are contested issues, and our system for contesting them is through the Parliament, and long may it continue, in my view. Now, the other point about nuclear energy in particular is that it's just a debate that we haven't had to have. We've had very low-cost generation in Australia through our abundant and well-located coal reserves. Haven't needed to think about nuclear energy. Now that there are another constraint comes into the policy-making decision on energy, that is carbon, we need to turn to that question. But right now, our generation market is incredibly oversupplied. We're seeing a number of coal-fired generations shut down and still record low prices because of oversupply through science-driven technology change for the declining cost of particularly of photovoltaics. Now we may need to, depending on, again, the parliamentary outcomes of long-run emissions reduction targets, whatever they may be, we may need to turn to that debate, and I believe when we need to, we will. But I don't think you can criticise Australia for not having had a nuclear debate when we haven't needed to. But again, in the optimistic signs, we're seeing South Australia just in the last week, a state that has challenges in terms of its economic and industrial base, and a Labor government turning to the idea of a Royal Commission to commence the discussion around the benefits or otherwise of a nuclear industry full cycle storage, processing, generation for South Australia. Why? Because they need to. At least they need to think about those sorts of issues given the industrial base. So I'm an optimist and a believer that contested decisions are best done through elected government. Thank you.
I have a question at the back.
My name is Beth Phillipson. I work in the Queensland Public Service. I was wondering if I could get the panel's opinion on whether or not it's worthwhile for the government to provide more open data to the general community and the scientific community, and if, I guess, changing that direction of communication would help improve the policy-science divide.
Could I might have first go on that? The answer is absolutely yes. I mean, I was very privileged to be on the Gov 2.0 panel that Nicholas Gruen ran 3 or 4 years ago. It's certainly one of the things that I'll be emphasising in my current role. It's one of the things that the Minister Malcolm Turnbull and his recent announcements about the Digital Transformation Office is particularly keen on. We are way too keen in government to want to build the website or even build the app, which is very old thinking, and a push for the open data. I think part of the problem, if I'll speak bluntly, is that open data has got mixed up with open government, and they're two quite separate things. You can have different views on those two things. Open data is something
we absolutely should be behind, and certainly something I'm keen to use what efforts I can to push forward.
I think in a lot of things where we're actually seeking to improve the lives and well-being and of our community and our environment, that the community members are the ultimate actors, and the better informed they are and the better engaged they are, in general, the better the outcomes. And I think it does also speak to that previous question that the Parliament are the elected representatives of the people, and it's how people engage, with the process. So I think that the more communication that's tailored and digestible, and actually is evidence based on the evidence of the best evidence we have, the better that granular activity, the better the activities that will improve things.
Yes, look, I'd just make a very simple addition. I agree precisely with those points. I just make this observation. The data is important, so is judgment. And what one needs is not just open, and you get to judgment by debate. You can get to data by research, but you only get to judgment. What do we reckon? Where there are no facts, there are value judgments or judgments about the future. They need open debate. And that open debate, that's in a sense what the political process is all about. So it is about, it goes back to my answer to the earlier question, it is about people with the data and in a position to make serious judgments, or just people with a view getting out there and taking part in the things. So it's not just a matter of government letting people get access to data. It's people taking that data and saying, what do I reckon about that? We can't sit back and assume that our politicians will get all this stuff right. Even we'll debate the right questions, or they don't get to the right answers.
Can I add to that too? Because I think there is a key role for government and for academics and scientists to improve the quality of the debate. Because there's a lot of debate going on, but often there are a lot of opinions without a lot of evidence. And so there is actually, I think, a really key role, a leadership role, of actually improving the quality and the intellectual component and the sort of rationality of debate.
We've got time effectively for one more question, although I've already got a few more booked in the pipeline. I hope people take opportunity to talk to the speakers during the lunch break which follows, but one from Katrina.
Oh dear, I'm taking the Cardinals and taking the last question. I'm going to make Cardinals in number 2, make a very brief comment on the question from up here, and this bounces off what Emily said and what Martin said and what Hugh said. I think academics and scientists have a responsibility to debate issues that are sometimes politically unpopular or unpalatable, often and frequently. Last year we ran a series of debates about nuclear energy in the public, but also in the confines of the Parliamentary Friends of Science, with a very enthusiastic response. Parliamentarians, even when they aren't in a position to make political statements about things, are often thirsty for the best kind of knowledge they can get, and it's the job of the science community to go forward and supply that better debate. Yay. I've got a question for Martin and Hugh. Emily, you're too optimistic for me. I want to ask you two to tell us whether we're wasting our time in this room. The more I think about this, the more I hear Hugh talking about it, the harder I think it is. What's the degree of difficulty for an average scientist who genuinely wants to make a contribution to policy making? Martin, I'd ask you to perhaps reflect on this, given your private sector background. Are we just kidding ourselves?
I'm not allowed to say anything.
Yeah, I think that's a bit unfair. No. No. The weird thing is it's not that hard. I would say, of course, that if you actually understand the game you're playing, that it is playing tennis on a 4-dimensional tennis court, and you do ask yourself the right questions and come up with answers to the questions that the policymakers have got in their mind. Don't just throw data or analysis at the policymakers, but I'm going to mix my metaphor, get into their boxing ring and start punching at them. You can do it. The terrifying thing is how easy it is to influence policy. I mean, government looks from the outside... No, this is the point. Government looks from the outside like this huge monolith. But when you get behind it, you know, don't take... There's a couple of deputy secretaries and they're running the whole show. And so it's surprising. I mean, it's a microsecond of anecdote. I'd never forget the first time I heard a minister in Parliament say words that I'd written. And it was terrifyingly early in my career. And I felt a kind of a shiver down my spine. Oh, yikes! How did that happen? The reason why I'm here, so to speak, in Canberra and in this business is how easy it is to influence government and how much fun it is. It's a very dirty word. You're not allowed to... It's called power. It's tons of fun.
Of course, I'm going to say absolutely yes. It's worth it. I can give the fancy platitudes, but to pull it down to a specific example from my last few years of work, there are 7 LNG projects being built in Australia today. Each one of those is bigger in real terms than the Snowy Mountains hydro scheme. That is the size of the investment that is being made in that sector. The social licence, strained though it is in parts, absolutely depends upon the work of science across a number of fields. So those projects that are driving the investment boom and export income to come for decades depend upon a social licence that is based almost entirely on the work of a range of scientific disciplines across academia that enabled policymakers to have the confidence to grant licences, to grant permissions under the EPBC Act, etc., etc. If the scientific community came out, as they have not done, and said differently to that which they did in relation to a number of the aspects of those projects, they wouldn't have happened. So science absolutely has a crucial role, both in those, as I said, those 2 points at the end of my speech, the ongoing processes of government, and 2, setting the national debate and direction going forward.
Can I say something unoptimistic? I think one thing we haven't talked about here is time and resources. So it is my experience of being involved in the policy process is that it is time consuming. If you want to do it well, you've got to do it long term, you've got to do it persistently, and you've got to be there in the place to work on it. Now, the constraints of scientists are that our sort of salary and career progression is based essentially on peer regard and on publications and citations. So actually, and although there's lip service paid to policy impact, it is often not really paid attention to. So there's a problem there that if scientists are going to engage, it takes them away from things which are actually about their, even the semblance of security that you have, because it's obviously also very insecure careers. So I think there's actually a genuine sort of material constraint that we're not really talking about. And I think a lot of the people who, like us, who are sort of saying how great it is to contribute, have careers that have meant that we have security in that way and that we can afford to spend the time engaging with it. It's very difficult when, for different parts of people in different parts of their career to really engage. And I think this forum says it's worthwhile, but you probably do need to be quite strategic and judicious about it. And I think the onus is also on the university and academic sector to recognise its importance and to reward it.
Thank you.